He wants the supreme leader gone? That is a bold wish indeed. These were the gasps echoing across countless news networks when one of the most polarizing figures on the global stage demanded Iran's top cleric bow to what he called the unstoppable might of an entire nation. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu had just announced that the Israeli Defense Forces would not hesitate to strike Iran should the regime continue on its controversial path, and the international audience was left wondering, is Iran's Ayatollah Ali Khamenei truly on the brink of being dethroned, and what might the aftermath of such a seismic event look like? Today, we are going to unravel the swirling questions around who could possibly lead Iran if its current supreme leader falls from power. We will examine the fragmented nature of each opposition group, explore the possibility of military rule, and discuss why the conversation around leadership in Tehran has become more urgent than ever. We will also piece together how the words of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu have once again catapulted Iran's internal politics into the global spotlight, as well as why former United States President Donald Trump's threats added fuel to the fire. In this deeply engaging saga, we will look at how a single statement demanding unconditional surrender led to a storm of speculation in a nation that has been shaped by long-standing ideological struggles. Prepare yourself for an in-depth examination of hidden power structures, exiled leaders, and the haunting echoes of past revolutions. In this episode, we will reveal the major factions jostling for influence, from the People's Mujahideen organization and its tempestuous journey through 20th century upheavals to the monarchists who dream of restoring a centuries-old dynasty. Along the way, we will delve into the role of Iran's ethnic minorities, whose voices could tilt the balance of power in key regions. And we will not forget the activists and protest leaders who once rattled the foundations of the Islamic Republic. By journey's end, questions of martial law and civil unrest bubble to the surface, as we assess the potential for a new power struggle that might upheave the entire Middle East. But first, imagine that iconic broadcast moment. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu addresses the Iranian people on live television, declaring that their day of liberation is near. While some observers dismiss this as typical political rhetoric, others found it a dramatic escalation of language reminiscent of a time when bold proclamations preceded major conflicts. Within days, the United States had weighed in as well. Then President Donald Trump, known for his polarizing foreign policy stances, brazenly stated that Ali Khamenei should either step down or hand over complete control of Iran's nuclear ambitions, going so far as to claim that the United States could remove him from power at any chosen moment. For many in Tehran, this ratcheted up tensions to an alarming degree, no small feat for a society that has lived with threats of international confrontation for decades. At the heart of it all sits the grim possibility, could Ayatollah Khamenei be deposed? And if that unthinkable event were to occur, what next? In discussions of massive geopolitical shifts, the problem of succession rarely remains theoretical. The power vacuum created when influential leaders vanish inevitably leads to chaos, or at the very least, uncertainty. Iran, scarred by revolution in 1979, wars in the decades that followed, and multiple waves of internal dissent, stands on a precarious precipice. So, the question remains, who is waiting in the wings to lead one of the Middle East's most pivotal nations? Our journey begins with an organization that has become something of an enigma, the People's Mujahideen organization, often referred to by its Persian name, the Mujahideen-e-Khalq organization. Once a left-leaning militant group that zealously opposed the Shah of Iran, it aligned with other revolutionaries who toppled the monarchy in 1979. However, the honeymoon period did not last long. As the newly ensconced Islamic Republic solidified power, the Mujahideen found itself shunted aside amid ideological disagreements. Soon, it landed on the opposite side of the conflict, even siding with Iraq during the brutal conflict of the 1980s. This traitorous stance in the eyes of many Iranians earned it thousands of potent foes, and though its influence waned in later decades, the group retains a devoted core of followers. The Mujahideen's exiled leadership comprises a duo whose mystique has only grown with time. Masoud Rajavi, long unseen in public, and his wife Mariam Rajavi, who has effectively taken the reins. Through the establishment of the National Council of Resistance of Iran, the Mujahideen maintains a visible public face in Western capitals. While critics accuse it of cult-like practices and human rights abuses, supporters endorse its unwavering stance against the Islamic Republic. For some Iranians, the People's Mujahideen organization is a time-worn relic, but in moments of crisis, historical movements can blaze back to relevance in surprising ways. As we examine if it is truly capable of leading the country, we should remember that deeply divided societies have, in the past, rallied around once marginalized groups under the right conditions. Pivoting from the revolutionary left to the heirs of a toppled monarchy, our next potential contender is Reza Pahlavi, son of the last Shah of Iran, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi. When revolution transformed Iran into an Islamic republic in 1979, the once dignified monarchy fled, leaving the legendary peacock throne behind. The young heir took up residence in the United States, where he has resided in a perpetual state of exile. In interviews spanning decades, Reza Pahlavi has called for regime change and free elections, hoping to see the Iranian people vote in a new political arrangement. Some supporters believe that monarchy could unify the country as it did in centuries past, while others see the monarchy as an outdated concept in a modern republic. Outside of media interviews and diaspora circles, however, the question remains, is there a real appetite inside Iran for a return of the Pahlavis? Opinions are fractured. Some recall the monarchy's excesses and the exploitation that led to widespread anger before 1979. Others, disillusioned by the Islamic Republic's religious authoritarianism, yearn for what they perceive as a less restrictive era. Even among monarchists, disagreements simmer around who would hold the crown and what powers that figure would wield. Reza Pahlavi has sometimes cast himself as a more ceremonial figure, interested primarily in guiding the nation to a secular and democratic future. In a post-Khamenei scenario, it is not inconceivable that the monarchy could re-enter caretaker roles, at least symbolically, though many Iranians remain skeptical. No discussion of potential leadership in Iran would be complete without acknowledging a profound reality. The country is ethnically diverse. Persian speakers form the majority, but substantial minority populations of Kurds, Baluchs, Arabs, Azeris, and others represent an often overlooked aspect of the country's political tapestry. For decades, groups in Kurdish provinces have bemoaned marginalization and carried out insurgent attacks at various points in Iranian history, particularly in the aftermath of the 1979 revolution. Meanwhile, the Baluch minority in southeastern Iran has also staged periodic resistance, some driven by calls for more rights, others influenced by extremist ideologies. Could an event like Khamenei's overthrow transform long-standing local grievances into aspirations for autonomy or independence? If so, the nation might find itself grappling with increased regional unrest. The myriad Kurdish groups range from democratic activists seeking recognition to armed factions more aligned with regional Kurdish politics, spanning Iraq, Syria, and Turkey. In the Baluchistan region, tensions, religious, cultural, and economic, have simmered for decades. A power vacuum at the top could embolden some of these groups to press their demands more forcefully. Whether that path leads to constructive negotiations or widespread destabilization is anyone's guess. Intriguingly, some of the most mesmerizing voices to emerge in Iran's modern political landscape come from the leadership of mass protest movements. Take 2009's Green Movement, for example, which erupted after allegations that presidential elections had been rigged in favor of Mahmoud Ahmadinejad. Hundreds of thousands of protesters took to the streets, demanding a recount or an entirely new election. Mir Hossein Mousavi, the central opposition candidate, found himself thrust into the global spotlight. Alongside him stood former parliament speaker Mehdi Karoubi, both calling for democratic reforms within the Islamic Republic's framework. But after a brief surge, the authorities cracked down mercilessly, placing Mousavi and Karoubi under house arrest. The Green Movement disintegrated under the weight of arrests, censorship, and infiltration, leaving a sense of dashed hopes that has lingered over the Iranian political scene. Today, both Mousavi and Karoubi remain marginalized figures, symbols of a moment that nearly blossomed into something transformative. Could the spirit of the Green Movement re-emerge under a different banner, or is its legacy too deeply buried by years of oppression? Fast forward to the protests of 2022, ignited by outrage over women's rights and rigid social restrictions. In those demonstrations, figures like Narges Mohammadi, a relentless activist for human rights, made headlines, especially when she garnered recognition on the global stage. Yet these protest leaders, too, found themselves on the receiving end of harsh reprisals. Many are behind bars in the infamous Evin prison, which has gained international notoriety for housing political detainees in difficult conditions. The question looms, if the weight of the clerical establishment were suddenly removed, could these protest figureheads unify and guide a shattered society? Hovering over all such scenarios is the formidable presence of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. The IRGC is no mere branch of the armed forces. It is an economic powerhouse, a political influencer, and a critical enforcer of the Islamic Republic's ideological framework. Since its inception in the wake of the 1979 revolution, the IRGC has grown in stature and resources, acquiring stakes in everything from construction projects to telecommunications. Many see it as a state within a state. Were the supreme leader to be forcibly removed, there is no guarantee that the IRGC would willingly stand by and watch a patchwork coalition fill that vacuum. Quite the contrary. Some analysts argue that any major transition in Iran would likely go through the IRGC. In a scenario of violent upheaval or abrupt power vacuums, the IRGC might step in as a caretaker government, imposing martial law during a turbulent transition. This raises thorny questions. Could a caretaker government be an improvement over clerical rule, or would it entrench another form of authoritarianism? Historically, when militaries step into political turmoil, they often claim to safeguard public order, but sometimes fail to relinquish power once the immediate crisis subsides. That possibility alone casts a long shadow over any conversation about dramatic political change in Tehran. If you find these twists and turns as captivating as we do, consider supporting this detailed breakdown by giving us a friendly nod of approval. Your encouragement helps us dive deeper into these complicated conflicts. Another dimension we cannot ignore is the broader regional and global impact. A sudden power transition in Iran, triggered by external military strikes or internal coups, would not occur in a vacuum. Neighbors such as Iraq, Turkey, and Pakistan might find themselves dealing with waves of refugees, increased cross-border tensions, or surges of radical factions. Iraq, still recovering from years of internal strife, shares a long border with Iran that runs through historically contested territory. Turkey, with its own sizable Kurdish population, might worry about a renewed Kurdish insurgency fueled by instability in Iranian Kurdistan. Pakistan, reeling from myriad internal challenges, could experience negative spillovers in its own Baluchistan region if Iranian Baluch suddenly decide their hour has come. On a global scale, energy markets would respond chaotically if upheaval in Iran threatened the flow of oil through the Middle East. Strained Western economies might scramble to manage skyrocketing fuel prices amid new sanctions or blockades. Moreover, any major conflict in Iran could draw in both world powers and regional players, leading to a risk of proxy wars. The Islamic Republic has been a pivot in Middle Eastern politics for decades, influencing conflicts in Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen, among other hotspots. A meltdown in Tehran's leadership might rearrange alliances or intensify existing ones. It seems entirely plausible that in the era of instant media updates and divided global alliances, no single event in Tehran would remain contained within Iranian territory. But let us pause to consider a key question. Are we overstating the likelihood of Khamenei's removal? Historically, Iran's supreme leadership has proven highly resilient, shielded by a layered security apparatus, robust propaganda, and alliances with influential clerics. Even during times of intense protests, 2009 being a prime example, sizable parts of the population did not wholeheartedly join the uprising. Some Iranians who dislike the regime still fear foreign intervention more. Others, swayed by official media, believe that calls for regime change came from abroad. This combination of fear, inertia, and deeply rooted religious sentiment can lend surprising endurance to a leadership many outsiders see as vulnerable. Yet in the aftermath of high-profile calls from figures like Donald Trump urging the Iranian people to rise up, the conversation about who might succeed Khamenei, or replace him entirely, has moved from academic debate to spirited discussion. Some channels outside of Iran have begun speculating on cabinet rosters for a post-clerical Iran. Exiled politicians hold virtual conferences, hoping to unify fragmented factions. Meanwhile, underground activists in Iran compile digital pamphlets, imagining transitional councils or provisional technocrat-based governments. but consensus remains elusive. One reason for this fragmentation is the deeply emotional, often traumatic history of the 1979 revolution. That event toppled the powerful monarchy and replaced it with a religious system that has, over time, consolidated authority in the hands of its supreme leader. Many Iranians still recall the jubilant crowds that welcomed the idea of a republic in the name of liberty, only to discover that not all forms of revolution lead to the freedom they envisioned. This cautionary tale weighs heavily on the Iranian psyche, making the population wary of overthrow attempts lacking a clear plan for what comes next. Samira, a fictional composite of countless Iranian citizens we might encounter, stands in Tehran's Grand Bazaar. She overhears rumors that the supreme leader's fall is imminent, but rather than celebrating, she worries about potential anarchy, meddling foreign troops, or new forms of domestic repression. Indeed, Afghanistan's fate after decades of war, or Libya's tumultuous experience following regime collapse, serve as cautionary stories for Iranians who dread the possibility of becoming the next battleground for rival groups competing for power. The memory of how quickly order can disintegrate underscores the refrain, "Be careful what you wish for." That cautionary stance explains why even vocal opponents of the Islamic Republic rarely offer a fully fleshed out roadmap for a peaceful transition. The notion of toppling a government is simpler than the reality of installing an inclusive leadership that can pull Iran's economy from crisis, maintain civil order, and ensure personal freedoms. The diaspora might speak passionately about democracy, but everyday people inside Bahrain understand how easily ideals can falter in the face of organized power structures, like the IRGC or well-funded extremist factions. The new wave of protest movements has had some success shining a spotlight on universal concerns, women's rights, economic mismanagement, and demands for social justice. Yet with heavy-handed crackdowns, many of the charismatic protest leaders find themselves behind bars. An imprisoned figure such as Narges Mohammadi, championed by human rights organizations worldwide, might inspire hope from within the confines of Evin prison. But the chasm between idealistic activism and real political leadership remains vast. Nonetheless, historical moments show how fast a charismatic movement can surge if a regime's bedrock cracks. Consider next how external powers shape the conversation. Military intervention, especially from mere rhetoric to actual conflict, can transform even a moderate opposition into fierce nationalists. When foreign bombs drop, nuance often disappears, replaced by the rally around the flag effect. Thus, calls for regime change from Israel or the United States might unwittingly strengthen the same Iranian leadership they aim to unseat, unless, of course, the global powers coordinate a stable transitional path. Still, if external forces miscalculate, we could see a harrowing repeat of scenarios witnessed in other Middle Eastern contexts where transitional plans failed horribly. And so, the labyrinth of politics in Tehran continues, shaped by factions that vie for influence. On one side, you have the exiles, many from wealthy families, some old enough to recall the thriving salons of pre-revolutionary Tehran. On another side, you have an entire generation born after 1979, far removed from the monarchy's pomp, who only know the rhetoric of the Islamic Republic. Among them are those who took to the streets during the 2009 Green Movement, chanting for freedom, only to be subdued by baton-wielding forces. Time and again, these generational perspectives clash. Right in the middle stands the Iranian diaspora, scattered across Europe, North America, and beyond, divided over what the moment requires. Some push for a swift removal of the supreme leader, championing calls from foreign figures. Others, aware of how destructive outside interventions have been in the Middle East, argue for an internal, purely Iranian-led shift. Meanwhile, voices from major diaspora communities in Los Angeles, London, and Paris are not always in sync with the experiences of people still residing in Tehran, Mashhad, or Tabriz. Then, of course, there is the looming specter of civil war. If Khamenei is removed amidst chaos, factions inside and outside of Iran might clash on the streets. The IRGC, bent on preserving influence, might face off against an unlikely coalition of monarchists, minority groups, and protest leaders. Such a conflict could tear the country's social fabric to shreds. Regional actors, too, could jump in. Some might back certain rebel factions, while others might funnel resources to whichever side seems friendlier to their geopolitical goals. The possibility of an unending conflict akin to Syria's brutal civil war cannot be taken off the table. We do not want to be the next Syria. That phrase has been shouted on Iranian streets in those ephemeral moments of protest fervor. This is the gnawing fear that chaos may become so severe it calls adversaries from every corner to exploit a divided nation. Yet, for all the gloom, there remains a core optimism among some Iranians that a strong enough coalition of reformists, secularists, and moderate religious figures could guide a transitional government if the regime collapses. The synergy needed for that path, though, appears elusive at present. Sometimes, the controlling narrative is colored by the typical pattern. External powers threaten intervention, Iranian officials issue dire warnings about national sovereignty, and calls for measured dialogue get lost in the noise. But behind the scenes, activists continue planning, exiled figures continue networking, and grassroots campaigns continue forging new alliances. It is this invisible undercurrent that could, one day, suddenly burst into view and reshape the entire political landscape. If you are intrigued by the hidden details and the emotional stakes of Iran's potential transformation, consider subscribing or following our deep dives into global affairs. You will not want to miss the next riveting development as new puzzle pieces come to light. As we near the end of our exploration, let us revisit the ultimate question. If Ayatollah Khamenei were deposed tomorrow, who might take the reins of a fractured yet crucial Middle Eastern power? It might be exiled leftists returning to claim an old mantle. It might be the monarchy's heir offering a symbolic unifying figure. It could be the IRGC, imposing draconian order amid the wreckage of the clerical establishment. Perhaps an unlikely coalition of protest leaders emerges, bridging ethnic and religious divides to draft a new constitution. The short answer is that no one knows. The longer answer, drawn from Iran's tumultuous history and complex societal layers, is that every scenario is simultaneously possible and fraught with difficulties. And that is precisely why this conversation stands at the center of so many global concerns. Iran's future leadership will shape everything from international nuclear talks to Middle Eastern alliances, from energy markets to migration patterns. If it remains under the guardianship of a supreme leader, well-versed in defensive statecraft, the status quo continues, even if unpredictably. Should violent regime change occur, the region may descend into the type of power struggle not seen since the catastrophic conflicts of the early 21st century. If a negotiated transition emerges, we might witness a rare instance of Middle Eastern diplomacy, forging a new template for peaceful reform in an authoritarian environment. This moment is pregnant with possibilities, each one reverberating far beyond Iran's borders. And so, we keep watching, analyzing, and debating. For now, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei's hold on power remains. For how long, no one can say with certainty. The complexity of Iranian politics, the potency of the IRGC, the resilience of the supreme leader's support base, and the unpredictability of external intervention all weave a tapestry that could unravel in countless ways. Yet one truth persists. The Iranian people themselves, the men and women in the bazaar, the youth in universities, the laborers in factories, the minority communities in remote provinces, and the activists yearning for change, will remain the deciding force in shaping their nation's destiny. No foreign speech or fighter jet can erase that. Should the day of transformation dawn, the identity of Iran's next leader will indeed be chosen, for better or worse, amid the voices and struggles of those who call that ancient land their home.